Hello, University of Michigan Ross School of Business. Welcome to National Coming Out Week. My name is Andrea Jenkins, and I am the Vice President of the Minneapolis City Council. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about my own coming out story, read a little poetry. Right now, I just want to thank my friend Dustin Hubretzi and all of the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this awesome event. And before I get started, I do want to acknowledge that wherever we are in the United States of America, we stand on stolen land in a country built on stolen labor. And so I am going to share an essay with you all that was published last year by Michigan State University Press in a journal, QED, a journal for GLBTQ world making. It's called Power to the People, the Stonewall Revolution. The first time I saw what I think was a drag queen was in 1969. I was 9 years old on the bus with my mother and sister in Chicago. There were two people who were clearly assigned male at birth, but expressing very feminine identities. They were both African American. Both had beautifully coiffed hair done up in the feminine style of the day, which was a bouffant, wearing fur coats and carrying women's handbags. Everyone on the bus was staring at them, some openly, some more discreetly. I was equally fascinated and disgusted at the same time. Fascinated because they were outwardly expressing how I felt inside. You see, I had wished I was born a girl since I was old enough to recognize myself in the context of the world, which was about 4 years old. My grandmother would even say, "You should have been born a gal with all that thick hair and pretty legs." Then she would grab my hair and yank it as if to say, "But you weren't though, so toughen up." I was disturbed by the two sissies. That was the language in the black neighborhood in the 1960s. And I knew that society did not approve of that behavior. Little did I know, at the same time, two drag queens, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, in New York City, were hanging out together in places like the Stonewall Inn, being harassed by the police, marginalized by society, denied access to employment, scapegoated by closeted gays, and mocked by feminist lesbians. And that they would resist that harassment one night in late June, initiating what we know as the Stonewall riots. I knew that I didn't want to face the type of scorn that the drag queens faced on that city bus. So I buried my feelings deep. Deep enough that no one could clock my tea, to use the intra-community expression. I would cross-dress whenever I had the opportunity. I fantasized about being a girl frequently, like almost every day. But in everyday life, I was a typical little boy. The scouts, sports, girlfriends, etc. That went on all through high school and halfway through college, until I was discovered having sex with an older white man by my roommate/frat brother. He outed me to the entire fraternity, and I came out as bisexual, which at the time for me was the partial truth. Partial because I knew that I was transgender, but I could not imagine sharing that with anyone else at the time, not even myself. But I knew it was true. Once when I was 14 years old, I snuck downtown to the Chicago Public Library and read the Christine Jorgensen story in its entirety one afternoon. Her life seemed completely out of reach for me, both physically and societally. So for most of my 20s, I was an out bisexual. I had several relationships with men, one that lasted 3 years. I introduced him to my family and traveled to Philadelphia to meet his. But the more I began to express my feminine identity, the more uncomfortable my boyfriend became. We eventually broke up, but it was the 80s, which started out as the apex of the sexual revolutionary decade, but rapidly became the decade of AIDS. Terror struck the GLBT community. So much beauty, creativity, and joy was lost in the 80s and 90s. I personally lost many dear friends, Steph, Big Earl, Jose, and my best friend, Mickey Jackson. Rest in peace. The world lost figures like Essex Hempel, Alvin Ailey, Rock Hudson, and so many others. It was devastating, and I retreated back into the closet. But the activist movement was full-blown by then. Borrowing tactics from the civil rights and women's rights movements, the struggle for gay liberation was organizing across the country in powerful ways. People began creating organizations and making their voices heard. Progress was happening. Minneapolis had already passed a human rights ordinance that protected LGBTQ people. Yes, it was specifically designed to include gender identity in 1975. Then in 1993, Minnesota became the first state in the country to pass a Human Rights Act that included protections for transgender people. During that time, I was struggling with my own gender identity. After a failed marriage that produced a beautiful daughter 31 years ago, I could no longer keep my true identity as a transgender woman buried. I finally came out to myself and to the world as trans. It's fascinating to me as I'm writing this. I am noting the shifts in language throughout this piece and throughout the course of the movement. I went to therapy at the program in human sexuality at the University of Minnesota, the other U of M. The program really helped me gain a deeper understanding about this part of my identity and how it fit in with the broader culture. I became politicized around the issues of trans acceptance and access to health care, preventing HIV and AIDS. This was a time of new thinking in the process of gender transitioning. Up until the early 90s, the theory was that a transgender person should have their surgery, change their name, move to a different community, and try to blend in. I resisted all of that. I knew that as a 6'2" black trans woman, I would not easily blend in most places. Plus, I had a responsibility as a parent. So I connected to my family, and there was a network of supportive people. I transitioned at my job at Hennepin County after 5 years and continued to work there for another 5. It was during that time that LGBT employee groups began to emerge. And I joined the group at Hennepin County because I figured that I need to have the support network. And I knew that the best way to get that support was to give support. So I volunteered. There's always been a strong, politically engaged LGBT community here in Minneapolis. So there were several organizations that formed to address the specific concerns and segments of the community. There was a statewide political advocacy organization, Outfront Minnesota. There was a youth community center, District 202. There was a philanthropic organization, P-Fund. I eventually served on the board of all three of these organizations and many others because I wanted to ensure that there was always a Black, trans feminine perspective voiced in these spaces. The first time I heard of Sylvia Rivera or Marsha P. Johnson was in 2003 when I introduced Dean Spade at a conference called All Gender Health at the University of Minnesota. He was discussing the documentary that the Sylvia Rivera Law Project produced called Toilet Training, Law and Order. Spade was the co-founder of the organization that was supportive of trans-identified folks experiencing poverty, discrimination, and violence. He's a trained attorney, an associate law professor at Seattle University, and SLRP provides legal assistance and advocacy for these communities. I began to get politicized about gender identity. Up until that point, I thought more about the emotional, spiritual, and physical aspects. But Spade and his passion about Rivera and Johnson intrigued me. A few years later, I met Torlamaine, formerly known as Raina Gossett, who is the co-director of SLRP. They were considered cutting edge at the time and still are, but were clear that this type of activism was not new, but had been buried by the predominant gay and lesbian narrative of marriage equality, and we are just like you. So, the word queer, it has been heavily associated with the gender non-conforming community that trends younger and non-binary. It has manifested in somewhat of a generational rift. The queer community, in my perspective, reflects the openness to alternative gender expression, a recognition of the intersections of racism, sexism, and capitalism. It is why this current generation is more critical of the corporatization of pride celebrations as reflected by the major protests that have disrupted many parades in recent years. The disparities between people of color and indigenous people that are present in the broader society exists within the LGBT community as well. It has to be the next wave of this movement if it is to be successful. And so all of the progress of these past 50 years, the modern LGBT movement has coincided almost directly with my own awareness of the world around me and how my identity was formed by that image of those two Black sissies on the bus that day. Two drag queens of color hanging out at the Stonewall Inn have converged to directly affect who I am today. I write this essay as the first openly trans Black woman elected to public office in the United States. And although I am proud of that achievement, I know that there are many, many other trans women of color, queer identified, gender non-conforming folks out there that are just as capable to be engineers, doctors, coders, entrepreneurs, actors, models, and corporate titans. I know this because many of them already are, but there are far too many who are struggling for access to employment, to safe and affordable housing, health care, and freedom from transphobia, racism, and poverty. These were the issues that Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were concerned about then and agitating against when they created Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries to address the needs of homeless trans kids of color on the piers of Manhattan. Their legacy inspired so many activists, artists, and advocates like Turla Maine, Cece McDonald, Laverne Cox, and Raquel Willis, just to name a few. There have been recent efforts to bring the story of Sylvia and Marsha to the big screen. The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson is one of them. But the film is controversial because it overshadowed another film, Happy Birthday, Marsha, produced by Tora Mullane, representing the same type of oppressive systems that Johnson and Rivera struggled to overcome. They were fed up with the demonization of Black and Latina trans identity. After 50 years of struggle, these same issues that they were deeply concerned about are plaguing our community today. This movement must return to an intersectional, cross-issue, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-sexist movement in order to achieve true liberation. To quote Sylvia Rivera's favorite saying, "Power to the people." Quarantine Soul. I only think of you on 2 occasions, and that's day and night. One Sunday morning, I listened to the entire discography of Luther Vandross. It made me smile. I cleaned my entire house, one room at a time. I found a jar of Miracle Whip dated used by 6/20/2008. Little Richard, the founding father of rock and roll, passed on. Oh, Lucille, why can't you be true? Our babies falling asleep at the breakfast table that doubles as their desk. Homeschool moms rule. Mother's Day came and went. Socially distant days and nights. Singularity. Solo dinner for one. Epic moments moves things. Epic moments make movements. Epic movements start with moments. 61 seconds was a movement. Jamar Clark was a moment. Oh, Lord, we miss Prince right now. He'd probably say something like, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to get through this thing called life." Prince went to Baltimore, wrote a song when Freddie Gray was killed and murdered, throat crushed, back broke. Yeah, Freddie got the knee choke too. There's a deeper, darker side operating just under the surface. It's like watching The Last Dance. Make you want to stand in line for 48 whole hours to get them new Jordans or Jeezys or that Popeye's fried chicken sandwich. Yeah, that's my addiction. Love it when mama cooking up them wings in the kitchen. But now we can't breathe. Because Ahmaud Arbery was murdered in the streets and Breonna Taylor was murdered in her sheets. It's being treated without respect. It's having to fight for everything. It's not getting the same chances. It's being left out like you don't matter. It's death. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to share my story. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this conference. Peace and love. Andrea Jenkins.